Robert Greene wrote the 48 Laws of Power in 1998, and inside American prisons, it became one of the most stolen paperbacks in the entire system. Guards confiscated it over and over, inmates traded it like real currency, and Robert Greene himself has said that fact disturbs him deeply. The book has sold multiple millions of copies worldwide since 1998, and it still sells strongly as a backlist title decades after it first came out. The audiobook edition alone has moved hundreds of thousands of copies on its own, which tells you this isn't a niche interest. It's genuinely one of the most read power books alive. But almost nobody talks about the 5 people who followed these laws the hardest, because every single one of them ended up losing everything. A Roman prefect who ran an empire from the shadows, and an Italian courtier who ruled France in everything but name. None of these 5 people were reckless amateurs. They were some of the most capable operators in their respective worlds, which is exactly what makes each fall worth studying closely. A blacksmith's son who rewrote English law, a dictator who built one of the biggest personality cults of the century, and a Silicon Valley founder once worth $9 billion. Each one of them mastered a specific law of power, rose incredibly fast because of it, and then watched that exact same law destroy them. That's the pattern we're going to trace across 5 case studies today: 1 law, 1 rise, 1 reversal, and 1 very specific downfall each time. Stick around for all 5, because the order they're presented in matters. Each case study builds on the lesson of the one before it. By the end, the connecting thread between a Roman prefect, a French courtier, an English minister, a Romanian dictator, and a Silicon Valley founder will be impossible to miss. Today we're breaking down 5 real case studies, one at a time, showing you the law they used and the exact moment it turned against them. Robert Greene has his own explanation for why this keeps happening, and he laid it out in a video on his own channel that passed 280,000 views. His argument is simple: these laws were never written as a manual for using power. They're a description of how power actually behaves in real life. That means every law comes with a hidden expiry date, useful on the way up, and dangerous the moment you're already standing at the top. Most people never notice when that switch happens, so they keep running the same play long after the rules underneath them have changed. In that same video, Greene frames the laws as tools for understanding power dynamics around you, not as a set of moves he expects you to actually deploy on other people. Every case study in this video is proof of exactly that framing: 5 people who treated a description of power as if it were a permanent instruction manual instead. That's exactly the trap that caught a Roman soldier named Sejanus, and his story is where this whole pattern begins. Lucius Aelius Sejanus commanded the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius, and by his 30s he was effectively running the city of Rome. Around 26 AD, Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri and handed the daily business of the empire almost entirely to Sejanus. Before that retreat, Sejanus had already consolidated the scattered Praetorian cohorts into a single fortified camp just outside Rome, giving himself one unified force instead of several small ones. This is Law 1 in its purest form: never outshine the master, except Sejanus didn't just outshine Tiberius, he replaced him in the public eye completely. He controlled the guard, built alliances across the Senate, married into the imperial household, and slowly isolated Tiberius's own son, a man named Drusus. None of this happened overnight. It was built cohort by cohort, favor by favor, over years of patient work inside the Praetorian ranks and the Senate floor. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded strong evidence that Sejanus had Drusus poisoned, quietly removing the one rival standing closest to the throne. For years, this worked exactly the way the law promises it should, and Sejanus became, in practical terms, the second most powerful man alive. Here's the part almost nobody mentions: the law only protects you while the master still feels flattered by your rise, not replaced by it. The instant Tiberius started to feel like an afterthought in his own empire, the entire arrangement that had protected Sejanus stopped meaning anything. On October 18, 31 AD, Tiberius sent a single letter to the Senate, quietly withdrawing every ounce of protection from Sejanus at once. Within hours, the Senate declared Sejanus and his entire family enemies of the state, and a mob lynched him in the streets that same day. The same senators who had courted his favor for years turned on him inside a single afternoon, the instant the letter made it politically safe to do so. His children were executed too, which was historically unusual, even by Roman standards, a clear sign of how total Tiberius wanted the erasure to be. One daughter was reportedly executed alongside her siblings despite ancient Roman law technically forbidding the execution of a virgin, showing just how far the Senate was willing to go once the emperor's intent was clear. Sejanus never adjusted his visibility as Tiberius grew more paranoid with age, and the exact behavior that built his empire is the same behavior that ended it. The second man in this pattern is far less famous, but he's the direct warning that shaped one of history's most successful power players. Concino Concini was an Italian courtier who attached himself to Marie de' Medici, who became Queen Regent of France after her husband's assassination in 1610. He collected titles fast: Marshal of France, Governor of Normandy, and a public profile that visibly eclipsed the actual king, a boy named Louis XIII. Marie de' Medici had become regent after Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, and Concini used her trust to acquire estates and influence at a pace few French courtiers had ever matched. This is the same law repeating itself: never outshine the master, except this time the master was a child, quietly growing up while watching it happen. The moment Louis XIII came of age in 1617, he stopped tolerating the arrangement, and the entire structure protecting Concini collapsed almost overnight. On April 24, 1617, royal troops killed Concini on the spot at the Louvre, the instant he arrived at the palace that morning. His wife, Leonora Galigai, was tried for witchcraft on flimsy testimony from servants, and beheaded on July 8th of that same year. Here's why this particular case matters more than it first looks. Concini was the direct predecessor of Cardinal Richelieu, France's next great power broker. Richelieu watched this entire collapse unfold in real time, and he made a deliberate different choice, visibly serving the crown instead of visibly outshining it. That one strategic difference is why Richelieu went on to run France for 18 years, while Concini didn't manage to survive even 7. Between 1610 and 1642, French court favorites who let themselves visibly outshine their king had roughly a 30-year run of ending in violence, and the lesson wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The third case flips the pattern in an interesting way, because Thomas Cromwell didn't fall from being too visible, he fell from being too useful. Cromwell became Henry VIII's chief minister in 1532, and he personally engineered the legal machinery behind the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He also built the dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, seizing enormous amounts of church land, and becoming one of the richest men in England through the redistribution alone. That single policy also earned him a title, Earl of Essex, and it made him one of the largest landholders in the entire country almost overnight. For most of his career, he followed law 4, always say less than necessary, working quietly behind the scenes instead of standing in the spotlight himself. A former blacksmith's son, with no formal education, Cromwell operated entirely through the king's known preferences, rarely claiming public credit for anything he engineered. But he had also built himself as indispensable, the mind behind every major policy of the reign, and that architecture only holds up if every policy succeeds. In January 1540, Cromwell personally arranged Henry's marriage to a German princess, Anne of Cleves, and Henry despised her from the very first meeting. The marriage was never consummated, and Cromwell, the man who had negotiated the entire match, became the visible face of the king's public humiliation. His enemies, led by the Duke of Norfolk, had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening, and they moved against him immediately. Henry's new favorite at court, a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper, joined that conservative faction in pushing the king toward one final decision about his once indispensable minister. Cromwell was arrested at a council meeting on June 10, 1540, convicted of treason without much of a defense, and executed on Tower Hill on July 28. Henry married Catherine Howard that very same day, the woman who replaced the Anne of Cleves match that Cromwell himself had personally built. Notice what connects all three of these men so far? They didn't fail by breaking the law they were using, they failed by never updating it. Sejanus and Concini were destroyed by the same law, applied in two different empires, over 1,000 years apart, which tells you this isn't a coincidence. It's a mechanism baked into how power itself works. Cromwell shows the same mechanism from a different angle, proving that even the quiet, credit-avoiding version of power has its own hidden expiry date built in. The fourth case takes a single law and pushes it to an almost industrial scale. Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist leader of Romania. He ran the Romanian Communist Party starting in 1965 and became president in 1974, building one of the largest personality cults of the entire century. This is Law 37, create compelling spectacles, executed through mass parades, monumental architecture projects, and tightly choreographed public demonstrations on a genuinely national scale. He also broke Law 46, never appear too perfect, letting state media present him as a master scientist, economist, military strategist, and songwriter all at once. State propaganda referred to him using honorifics that functionally denied he had any human limitations at all, a level of manufactured perfection that had no real precedent in the region. This worked for 24 straight years, until December 1989, when a revolt began in the city of Timisoara over the treatment of a persecuted pastor. That pastor, Laszlo Tukes, was a Reformed church minister the government tried to forcibly deport, and the local community that gathered to protect him is where the entire uprising ignited. The unrest spread fast, first to the armed forces, then directly to the capital city of Bucharest within a matter of days. On December 21st, Ceausescu gave a public speech from the Central Committee balcony, trying to project the exact same image of total control one more time. The crowd booed him live, on camera, in front of the entire country, and the spectacle he had spent 24 years building became the spark for the uprising itself. The army switched sides the very next day, and Ceausescu, along with his wife Elena, tried to flee the capital by helicopter. They were captured within hours, given a surreal one-day military trial at an army barracks, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. Romania stands out as the only country in the Eastern Bloc where the regime fell through violent popular revolt combined with instant military defection. The bigger the spectacle he built to control the crowd, the more violently that same crowd turned the instant it stopped believing him. The fifth case is the one this generation actually watched unfold in real time. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of the blood testing startup Theranos. Holmes built the Silicon Valley founder persona with more discipline than almost anyone else of her generation, the deep voice, the black turtleneck, the total silence about the actual science. She claimed her device could run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop, a version of Law 46 flipped inside out, appearing to transcend the technology itself entirely. By 2014, private investors valued Theranos at around $9 billion, with a board that included Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and former Defense Secretary James Mattis. Walgreens and the United States military both signed real partnerships, and for a moment, Holmes looked like the most successful young founder in the entire country. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former Secretary of State George Shultz sat on her board alongside four-star General James Mattis and former Senator Sam Nunn, an extraordinary lineup for a company that had never fully explained how its own machine worked. Then Wall Street Journal reporter Nick Bilton, working alongside insiders like Adam Rosendorf, exposed that the proprietary technology simply did not work the way it was advertised. The reporting showed the company was quietly running the vast majority of its blood tests on standard commercial machines it had purchased from other manufacturers, not the revolutionary device it had marketed for years. Federal regulators at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services voided Theranos' lab certifications, and the company shut its consumer blood testing business in September 2018. That same year, Holmes was federally indicted on 9 counts of wire fraud, and a jury convicted her on 4 of those counts in January 2020. On November 18, 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, and she reported to serve that sentence in mid-2023. Prosecutors had asked the court for $800 million in restitution, and the final order instead set her personal payment at just $125 a month. Her former deputy and romantic partner, Ramesh Balwani, was tried separately, convicted on 12 federal counts, and given an even longer sentence, 12 years and 11 months. Balwani had run the day-to-day laboratory operations while Holmes ran the public persona, which meant the fall, once it came, took down both halves of the partnership at the same time. The illusion of perfection that built a $9 billion company on paper is the exact same illusion that eventually put its founder in federal prison. 5 completely different centuries, 5 completely different worlds, and yet the exact same mechanism plays out every single time without exception. Sejanus and Concini both fell to a ruler's jealousy. Cromwell fell to one public failure. Ceausescu fell to a spectacle turned hostile, and Holmes fell to reporters who simply checked the facts. Every one of these 5 people used a law of power with real discipline, and every one of them genuinely won with it, at least for a while. Robert Greene's own stated position, repeated across his public interviews, is that these laws describe how power moves. They were never meant to be a permanent playbook. History keeps proving the same point again and again. The laws have an expiry date built into them, and almost nobody stops playing once that date has quietly passed. Here's the detail that ties all 5 cases together in one line. None of these people were stupid, and none of them were beginners at this game. Sejanus had run an empire's daily affairs for years, Cromwell had outmaneuvered the English nobility for a decade, and Holmes had convinced Henry Kissinger himself. What actually got each of them was not a lack of skill. It was the refusal to ask whether the law that built their rise still served them at the top. That single blind spot is worth remembering the next time any of us feel like a strategy that's been working for years couldn't possibly need to change. Sejanus had run Rome's daily affairs for the better part of 5 years before his letter arrived. Ceausescu had run an entire country for 24 years before the booze started. Holmes ran Theranos for 15 years, from its founding in 2003 all the way to the 2018 collapse, before a single newspaper story unraveled the whole structure in months. That's the real pattern underneath the dates and the names. The fall is always fast, but the setup that made the fall possible is always slow and gradual. None of these 5 people saw their own ending coming, because the law that was working for them had quietly stopped matching the situation they were actually standing in. Finney didn't see a child king becoming an adult one, Cromwell didn't see one failed marriage becoming the whole verdict on his career, and Holmes didn't see 2 reporters becoming a federal case. In every one of these 5 stories, the fall wasn't caused by an enemy discovering some hidden weakness. It was caused by a strength that simply ran a few years past its usefulness. There's one law we haven't touched at all today, and Robert Greene himself has called it the single hardest law in the entire book to actually live by. It has nothing to do with outshining anyone or building a spectacle. It's about recognizing the exact moment to walk away while you're still ahead. Every single person in today's video had a real window where they could have stepped back safely. Cromwell had one, Holmes had one, even Ceausescu had one, and none of them took it. That's the actual skill hiding underneath all 48 laws. Not knowing how to rise, almost everyone figures that part out eventually, but knowing precisely when to stop.